The Lighthouse. I once heard a story from a town not far from here. It sat on the coast and was a lovely place to live. It did, however, have a dark secret. Out on the edge of town, beyond the boardwalk, and past the slippery rocks sat an old lighthouse. These days, it's automatically run, but many years ago it was operated by a lighthouse keeper. That's where the story takes a dark turn. For many years, the lighthouse keeper lived completely alone. He used to come into town here and there, but over time he stopped even that. The only reason the people of the town knew he was still around was the fact that the lighthouse still operated normally. But one night, the people of the town noticed that the lighthouse didn't light up. A group of people went to investigate and were met by a grisly sight. The old lighthouse keeper must have finally been driven mad by the isolation. He had thrown himself from the top of a tower and smashed down on the rocks below. It was after this event that the town decided to invest in an automatic system so no one would need to go out to the lighthouse anymore. And so they did, but that didn't stop people from going out. In time, the lighthouse became the subject of a local legend. All the school kids claimed that the ghost of a lighthouse keeper remained in the tower, and if you were brave enough, you could go see him. As a result, the kids would often try to sneak out to the old lighthouse. Almost all the time, they got too scared and turned around less than halfway through, and so the legend grew. One day, a particularly brave boy decided declared to his classmates that he would make it all the way to the top of the tower and would see the phantom for himself. By doing this, he'd earned the title of the bravest boy in town. Many of the school kids cheered him on, and a few begged him not to go, but the boy was determined. And so, one particularly foggy night, the boy set off to the lighthouse. When he got to the building, he looked it over. The old house was nailed up with old boards, partially rotten by the sea breeze. It wouldn't take much to get inside. In fact, the planks covering the door had already been pried loose by other children previously attempting the challenge. With a stubborn nod, the boy headed inside. The old house attached to the lighthouse tower was definitely creepy. It was covered in dust and totally abandoned. Everything sat just the way it had when the keeper lived there. There was the eerie feeling of being watched, despite being all alone, but the boy ignored it. That wasn't why he was here, after all. The boy set his sights on the door across the room that led up to the tower. When he reached out and grabbed the handle, he recoiled. For some reason, it was ice cold. It felt like it had been inside a freezer or something. Again, this was odd, but not enough to scare the brave boy away, and so he opened the door. Ahead of him sat the seemingly endless staircase up to the top of a tower. The boy felt like he was climbing forever. About halfway up, something caught the boy's attention. It sounded as though someone was following him up the stairs. He quickly looked behind him, but saw nothing at all. He stood quietly for a minute, but the footsteps did not continue. As he resumed his climb, it got colder and colder. He could hear the sound of a vicious wind picking up outside. There must have been a crack somewhere letting it squeeze inside. The wind whistled loudly. The boy paused again when it seemed to almost speak. Turn back, the wind howled. This did actually make the boy a little nervous, but he shook his head and continued. He was here to prove his bravery, so there was no way a little wind was going to scare him away. So, as the wind continued to howl, and the distant sound of footsteps echoed behind him, the boy climbed faster and faster. Every so often he would look over his shoulder, but again, there was no one else there. Finally, the boy reached the top of the stairs. No one else at the school had ever made it this far. The boy walked forward and grabbed the handle to the door leading into the light room, but it wouldn't budge. The darn thing must have rusted over. He struggled with it a few more times, but still couldn't get it to move. Once more the wind blew, louder than ever. Turn back, it seemed to moan. The boy shivered, but ignored it. Instead, he decided to try peeking through the little window set into the metal door. It was dusty and grimy, so it was hard to see through, but after pressing his face right up to the glass, the boy could see. Inside was the little room where the keeper used to operate the light. It was anchored to the middle of the room and rotated around and around. This made it very hard to see into the room. Whenever the light spun back toward the boy, it was blinding, but whenever it turned away, the room became extremely dark. The boy squinted and tried his best to catch a glimpse of anything. Eventually, his eyes adjusted and he was able to see into the room for a few seconds before the light turned back to him and he closed his eyes. The room was completely covered in a thick layer of dust, right down to the floor. There was what looked like an old chair and a bunch of papers, but no sign of any ghost. What interested the boy most was the door on the other side of the room. That was the one that led outside. That's where the lighthouse keeper had jumped. The boy stared hard at the door until he suddenly noticed something. The handle moved. Goosebumps ran down the boy's back, but he couldn't look away. The light turned toward him, blinding him for a moment. When it turned away again, the boy saw that the handle was jiggling more violently now. It was impossible for anyone to be out there. Who was yanking on the doorknob? Blinded again, and when his sight returned, the door was slowly beginning to open. The boy was very frightened now, but was even more curious. The wind was howling even louder than before. Turn back! But the boy couldn't. Blinded again, and then the door was wide open. But still, no sign of anyone. The boy's heart beat faster and faster. He couldn't look away. Blinded once more. Now there were footprints in the dust. The boy knew he should stay no longer. He should flee, but he was far too curious. The footprints were halfway across the room. Blinded again. This time, nothing changed. The dusty room sat quiet. Way too quiet. The wind had stopped howling. The whole tower sat in perfect silence. The only thing the boy could hear was his own heartbeat. Blinded again. Wham! A ghostly figure slammed into the door, his eyes staring into the boy's through the small window in the door. Terrified, the boy stumbled backwards. He fell. He fell all the way down the stairs, and as he toppled downwards, the wind picked up one final time. Too